The desert wind carried memories through the Las Vegas streets on a Tuesday morning in March 2024, 25 years after the night that changed everything. Detective Sarah Chen stood in the archive room of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, surrounded by boxes that smelled of old paper and forgotten promises. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out case file 99 to 4721. The label faded but still legible. Riley Watson, missing person. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the photographs that spilled onto the metal table. Riley Watson smiled up from a high school portrait, her auburn hair catching sunlight that no longer existed, her green eyes holding secrets she would never tell. 18 years old. Disappeared March 15, 1999. Last seen leaving the Stardust Casino where she worked as a cocktail waitress. Her shift ending at 2 a.m. on a Saturday night when the strip was alive with neon dreams and whispered desires. Sarah had been 7 years old when Riley vanished. She remembered seeing the missing person posters taped to shop windows throughout the city, Riley's face becoming as familiar as the palm trees that lined the boulevards. Her own mother had clutched her hand tighter when they walked past those posters, whispering prayers that someone's daughter would come home. "You're really reopening this one?" Detective Marcus Webb leaned against the doorframe, his gray hair testament to 3 decades on the force. He'd been one of the original investigators, fresh-faced and determined in 1999, certain they'd find Riley within days. The case had aged him in ways that time alone couldn't explain. "New DNA technology," Sarah said, holding up an evidence bag containing a cigarette but found near Riley's abandoned car. "We can extract profiles from samples that were useless 25 years ago. I sent this for retesting 3 months ago. Results came back yesterday." Marcus stepped closer, his weathered face suddenly alert. "And we got a match in Cody's full profile. Marcus, we know who was with her that night." The older detective's hand found the edge of the table, knuckles whitening. "Who?" Sarah pulled out a printed report, the name highlighted in yellow. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder might shatter the fragile truth they'd finally captured. "Thomas Brennan." The silence that followed felt like the moment before an earthquake, when the world holds its breath and waits for everything to break. Marcus's face drained of color. "City Councilman Thomas Brennan? The Thomas Brennan who's running for mayor?" "The same." Sarah spread out more documents across the table. "He was 26 in 1999, working as a property manager for one of the casino companies. No criminal record then, no criminal record now. Married, 3 kids, pillar of the community. His campaign posters are all over town." Marcus sank into a chair, the metal creaking under his weight. "We interviewed him back then. He said he didn't know Riley, had never been to the Stardust that night. We had no reason to doubt him. He lied." Sarah's finger traced the timeline she'd reconstructed over countless sleepless nights. Riley's co-worker, Jennifer Martinez, told investigators that Riley had been seeing someone older, someone who worked in real estate and drove a silver BMW. She said Riley was excited but secretive about it, like she knew people wouldn't approve. "We followed up on that," Marcus protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "We talked to every real estate broker and property manager in a 50-mile radius. Except Thomas Brennan wasn't licensed yet in 1999. He was working under his father's company, Wallace Brennan Properties. The records listed him as facility supervisor, not property manager. The search parameters missed him." Sarah pulled out another photograph, this one grainy and water-damaged, recovered from Riley's locker at the Stardust before the casino was demolished in 2007. It showed Riley sitting in a car, laughing, her hair wild around her face. Only part of the driver was visible. A man's hand on the steering wheel, wearing a distinctive silver watch with a turquoise band. "Look at this," Sarah said, sliding her laptop around. On the screen was a campaign photograph of Thomas Brennan from 1998, 1 year before Riley disappeared. On his wrist, an identical silver watch with a turquoise band. His father gave him that watch when he graduated from UNLV. He wore it in every photo from that era. It was his signature piece. Marcus studied the images, his trained eye catching the matching details, the same rectangular face, the same distinctive turquoise inlay. It's circumstantial. The DNA isn't. Sarah's voice hardened with certainty. That cigarette but was found on the driver's side of Riley's car, which was abandoned in a parking lot off Flamingo Road. The car was locked, no signs of struggle, but Riley was gone. Her purse was in the passenger seat. Her keys were in the ignition. Whoever smoked that cigarette was either Riley's last passenger or the person who moved her car after whatever happened. Thomas Brennan doesn't smoke, Marcus said quietly. I've seen him at city council meetings for years. Never once seen him with a cigarette. He did in 1999. Sarah produced another piece of evidence. A witness statement from a Stardust security guard named Raymond Torres, who'd since passed away from cancer in 2015. Torres reported seeing Riley leave through the employee exit at 2:07 a.m. He said she got into a silver BMW in the parking lot. The driver lit a cigarette as they drove away. Torres remembered because Riley had told him earlier that week she was trying to get her boyfriend to quit smoking. The pieces were assembling into a picture that had remained hidden for a quarter century, obscured by time and circumstance and one man's careful lies. Sarah felt the weight of Riley Watson's ghost pressing against her shoulders, urging her forward into territory that would shatter comfortable illusions. We need to talk to Jennifer Martinez again, Marcus said, his detective's instinct overriding his shock. She was Riley's closest friend. If anyone knew the truth about this relationship, it was her. I already did. Sarah opened another folder, revealing pages of handwritten notes. I drove to Henderson last week. Jennifer's married now, has 4 kids, works as a school nurse. She cried when I showed her Riley's photo. Said not a day goes by she doesn't think about her friend. What did she tell you? Sarah's eyes met Marcus's, and in that moment, they were united by the ancient purpose that had drawn them both to this work, the need to speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves. She said Riley was planning to end the relationship. The guy was getting possessive, controlling. He didn't like her working at the casino, didn't like her talking to other men. Jennifer said Riley was scared but trying to hide it. She told Jennifer she was going to break it off that night, after her shift. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The archive room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in with the gravity of what they'd uncovered. A young woman who'd wanted to be free, a man who couldn't let her go, and a city that had moved on while Riley Watson remained frozen at 18. Her dreams buried somewhere in the desert that surrounded them like an indifferent witness. When were you planning to bring him in? Marcus asked. Today. This afternoon. I've already briefed the captain and the district attorney. We have enough for an arrest warrant. Sarah glanced at her watch. 10:47 a.m. But I wanted you to know first. You carried this case for 25 years, Marcus. You deserve to be there when we close it. The older detective stood slowly, his joints protesting. He walked to the window that overlooked the parking lot, where the morning sun was already turning asphalt into shimmering heat. I used to see her mother around town, he said softly. Patricia Watson. She'd come to the station every few months for the first 5 years, asking if we had any updates. Always brought cookies, like she thought if she was nice enough, kind enough, we'd try harder to find her daughter. She stopped coming around 2008. Moved to Oregon to be near her son. Died in 2019 without ever knowing what happened to Riley. Her brother is still alive, Sarah offered. James Watson. He lives in Portland. Runs a contracting business. I called him yesterday after the DNA results came in. He's flying in tonight. He wants to be here when we make the arrest. Marcus turned back to face her, and Sarah saw tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. 25 years, he whispered. We failed her for 25 years. No, Sarah said firmly, standing to meet his eyes. The truth was hidden for 25 years. But today we're bringing Riley home. Today we're giving her justice. Outside, Las Vegas was waking to another day of slot machines and wedding chapels. Magic shows and buffet lines. Millions of people chasing dreams under the desert sun. None of them knew that the city's carefully constructed facade was about to crack, revealing the darkness that had hidden behind Thomas Brennan's smile for a quarter-century. Sarah gathered the files, each document a piece of Riley's stolen future. Somewhere in the desert, the wind continued to blow, carrying away secrets one grain of sand at a time. But not this secret. Not anymore. Riley Watson had loved Las Vegas the way some people love impossible things, knowing it could hurt her, but unable to look away. She'd arrived in the city 3 months before her 18th birthday, hitchhiking from Sacramento with $200 and a backpack full of dreams that weighed more than the clothes she owned. Her brother James had tried to stop her. He'd been 23 then, working construction and helping their mother pay rent on the apartment where they'd lived since their father left when Riley was 12. "Vegas will eat you alive," he'd warned, standing in their cramped kitchen while Riley stuffed granola bars into her bag. "You think it's all glamour and excitement, but it's not. It's people taking advantage of kids like you." But Riley had seen something different in the neon glow that called to her from television screens and magazine spreads. She'd seen possibility, freedom, a place where she could reinvent herself far from the shadow of her father's abandonment and her mother's sad eyes that saw only disappointment when they looked at her. The Stardust Casino had hired her 3 days after she arrived, impressed by her quick smile and the way she could remember complicated drink orders without writing them down. The uniform made her feel like someone new, someone important. The sequin dress caught the light as she moved between poker tables and slot machines, carrying cocktails to people who tipped well when they were winning and barely noticed her when they weren't. Jennifer Martinez had befriended her first, a 21-year-old cocktail waitress from North Las Vegas who'd been working the strip since she was 19. Rule number 1, Jennifer had told her during Riley's first shift, don't fall for the players. They all think they're going to win big, and they all think you're part of the prize. You're not. You're the help. Remember that. Riley had nodded, absorbing the wisdom, but she'd felt a small rebellion stir in her chest. She didn't want to be invisible. She'd spent her childhood being invisible. The daughter her father didn't love enough to stay for. The student teachers forgot to call on. The girl boys looked past to see prettier faces behind her. Her apartment was a studio in a building off Paradise Road, the kind of place where the air conditioning wheezed and the neighbors fought loudly enough to hear through walls. But it was hers. She paid for it with her own money, tips counted out in 1s and 5s and occasional 20s from generous high rollers who liked her laugh. In the evenings before her shift started, Riley would sit on her narrow balcony and watch the sun set over the mountains, turning the sky shades of orange and pink that looked like paint spilled across canvas. She'd write in a journal Jennifer had given her for Christmas, recording her observations about the city and its people. December 3rd, 1998. A man at table 7 tonight told me he'd lost his house payment at the blackjack table, but couldn't stop playing. He ordered scotch after scotch until the pit boss cut him off. His hands were shaking. I wanted to tell him to go home, to stop before it got worse, but I just smiled and brought him water instead. Is that what this place does? Makes you watch people destroy themselves and call it entertainment? December 15th, 1998. Jennifer says I think too much. She's probably right, but I can't help wondering what all these people are running from. Nobody comes to Vegas because they're happy where they are. We're all running from something. Bad marriages, boring jobs, small towns that feel like prisons. Maybe that's why I feel at home here. I'm running too. She'd met Thomas Brennan in January 1999, during a slow Tuesday afternoon shift, when the casino was mostly empty except for a few dedicated gamblers and the staff preparing for the evening rush. He'd been sitting at the bar, drinking coffee and reviewing blueprints spread across the polished wood surface. Riley had noticed him because he looked different from the usual clientele. Well-dressed but not showy, focused on his work rather than the slot machines chiming around him. Long day? She'd asked, refilling his coffee cup without being asked. He'd looked up with surprised eyes, as if enthused to being seen. Property inspection, he'd explained, gesturing at the blueprints. Making sure everything's up to code. Not as exciting as it sounds. Nothing's ever as exciting as it sounds. Riley had replied, and he'd laughed. A genuine sound that made her feel clever. They'd talked for 20 minutes during her break. An easy conversation about nothing important. He'd told her he worked for his father's property management company, that he'd grown up in Las Vegas before it became what it was now, when you could still see stars at night and knew your neighbors' names. She told him she was new to the city, that she was figuring things out as she went along. He'd asked for her phone number before he left. She'd hesitated, Jennifer's warning echoing in her mind. But something in his steady gaze made her feel seen in a way she'd been craving. She'd written her number on a cocktail napkin, the digits slightly smudged from her nervous fingers. The first date had been ice cream at a little shop downtown, away from the strip's chaos. Thomas had been charming, asking questions about her life and actually listening to the answers. He'd told her about studying business at UNLV, about his plans to eventually take over his father's company, about his love for the desert landscape that most people dismissed as empty wasteland. "There's beauty in harsh places," he'd said, watching the sunset from the parking lot after they'd finished their cones. "You just have to know how to look for it." Riley had felt herself falling, the way you fall in dreams, knowing you're falling but unable to stop. He was older, established, confident in ways that made her feel younger and more vulnerable than she'd wanted to admit. But he paid attention to her. He called when he said he would. He remembered small things she'd mentioned in passing, her favorite color, her childhood dog's name, the way she liked her coffee. For 2 months, it had been intoxicating. He'd take her to restaurants she couldn't afford on her own, introducing her to foods she'd never tried. He'd bought her a silver necklace with a small turquoise pendant, telling her it matched her eyes. She'd worn it every day, touching it during her shifts like a talisman of belonging. But slowly, so slowly she barely noticed at first, things had begun to shift. He'd started calling her multiple times during her shifts, asking where she was and who she was talking to. When she didn't answer immediately, because she was carrying a tray or dealing with a difficult customer, he'd sound hurt, distant, as if she'd betrayed him somehow. "I just worry about you," he'd explained when she finally confronted him about the constant calls. "Vegas is dangerous. The men in those casinos look at you like you're something they can own. I hate thinking about their eyes on you." She'd felt flattered at first, mistaking possessiveness for protection. But Jennifer had noticed the change in her friend. "He's isolating you," Jennifer had said bluntly one night as they changed out of their uniforms after closing. "You never come out with us anymore. You're always checking your phone, looking nervous. That's not what love looks like, Riley. That's control." Riley had defended him, but the words had planted seeds of doubt. She'd started noticing things, the way Thomas's jaw would tighten when she mentioned male coworkers, the way he'd show up at the casino unannounced to surprise her, the way he'd somehow always find reasons why she shouldn't spend time with anyone but him. The breaking point had come in early March, when she'd gone to a birthday party for one of the dealers without telling Thomas. She'd needed space, needed to remember who she was without his constant presence shaping her edges. He'd called 17 times during the 3 hours she was gone. When she'd finally answered, his voice had been cold, controlled in a way that frightened her more than yelling would have. "Where were you?" "At Sarah's birthday party. I told you about it." "No, you didn't. You said you might go. You didn't say you definitely were going." "I'm allowed to have friends, Thomas." Silence. Then, "Of course you are. I just worry when I can't reach you. Anything could happen." But the next day, he'd shown up at her apartment with flowers and apologies, telling her he'd been under stress at work, that his father was pressuring him about taking on more responsibility. He'd been sweet again, gentle, the version of himself she'd fallen for. She'd wanted so badly to believe it was real. Jennifer had been insistent when Riley finally confessed the full truth of what was happening. "You need to end this," she'd said, gripping Riley's hands across the table in the employee break room. "I've seen this before. It doesn't get better. It only gets worse. Promise me you'll break it off." Riley had promised. She'd planned to do it on March 15th, after her Saturday shift. She'd rehearsed the words in her mind during the entire evening, serving drinks with shaking hands and a smile that felt like it might crack her face. But she'd been scared too. Scared of how Thomas would react, Scared of being alone again. Scared of losing someone who'd made her feel special even as he tried to make her feel small. The contradictions had exhausted her, leaving her hollow and uncertain. At 2 a.m., when her shift ended and she'd walked through the employee exit into the cool desert night, Thomas had been waiting by his silver BMW. He'd smiled at her, that same smile that had first caught her attention months ago. But this time she'd seen something different behind it. Something that made her heart race with fear instead of excitement. "We need to talk," he'd said, and she'd gotten into the car because she'd thought a public parking lot was safe. Thought she could say the words she'd been practicing and then leave. She'd thought she had control over her own story. She'd been wrong. 25 years later, as Sarah Chen prepared the arrest warrant and Marcus Webb gathered the evidence files, Riley Watson remained 18 years old in everyone's memory. Frozen in time by violence that had silenced her voice and stolen her chance to become whoever she might have been. In Portland, James Watson packed a bag for his flight to Las Vegas, his hands steady despite the grief and rage warring in his chest. He'd spent a quarter-century wondering what had happened to his baby sister, imagining scenarios that ranged from hopeful to horrific. Now he knew. Now there was someone to blame. And in his campaign headquarters on Charleston Boulevard, Thomas Brennan reviewed his schedule for the day, smiling at staffers who believed in his vision for Las Vegas's future, shaking hands with donors who saw him as their best hope for responsible leadership. The silver watch with the turquoise band gleamed on his wrist, catching the light as he moved through the room like a man who'd never broken a promise or told a lie. He had no idea that the past was about to reach up through 25 years of carefully maintained silence and drag him down into the truth he'd been running from since the night Riley Watson had wanted to be free. The arrest happened at 3:47 p.m. on March 19, 2024, in the parking lot of Thomas Brennan's campaign headquarters. Sarah Chen had wanted it to be clean, professional, away from cameras and the media circus that would inevitably follow. But news traveled fast in Las Vegas, faster than lies, faster than truth. And by the time 3 unmarked police vehicles pulled into the lot, 2 news vans were already circling like vultures sensing something dying. Thomas Brennan was walking to his car when Sarah approached, her badge held up like a shield against the afternoon sun. Marcus Webb flanked her right side, 2 uniformed officers behind them. Thomas's smile, the practiced campaign smile that had won him endorsements and donations, faltered when he saw their faces. "Mr. Brennan, I'm Detective Sarah Chen with Las Vegas Metro. I need you to come with us." "I'm sorry, Detective, but I have a fundraiser at 6. Perhaps we could schedule something for tomorrow." His voice remained smooth, controlled, but Sarah saw his eyes calculating exits, possibilities, the distance to his car. "This isn't a request, sir. Thomas Brennan, you're under arrest for the murder of Riley Watson." Sarah's voice carried across the parking lot, clear and certain. "You have the right to remain silent. This is insane." Thomas took a step back, his hands rising in a gesture of confused innocence. "I don't know what you're talking about. Riley Watson, that missing girl from the 90s? I barely knew her. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. I want my lawyer. Right now. I'm not saying another word without my lawyer present." "You have the right to an attorney." The handcuffs clicked shut around Thomas's wrists, the sound sharp and final in the desert heat. Camera shutters clicked in rhythm with the cuffs, capturing the moment when a man's carefully constructed life collapsed into rubble. Thomas's face went through several transformations in rapid succession. Shock, anger, fear, before finally settling into a mask of wounded innocence. "This is a witch hunt," he said, loud enough for the cameras to catch. "I'm running for mayor and suddenly, conveniently, I'm accused of a crime from 25 years ago? This is political persecution. My lawyers will destroy this." Sarah said nothing as they led him to the patrol car. She'd heard it all before, the denials, the accusations, the desperate attempts to reshape reality through sheer force of will. But DNA didn't lie. Evidence didn't have political agendas. Riley Watson's ghost demanded justice, and Sarah was determined to deliver it. Back at the station, the interrogation room was small and deliberately uncomfortable, designed to make guilty people sweat and confess. Thomas sat across from Sarah and Marcus, his expensive suit rumpled from the ride. His lawyer, Gerald Moss, one of Las Vegas's most prominent defense attorneys, beside him like a well-dressed guardian angel. "My client maintains his complete innocence," Gerald began before Sarah could speak. "He's cooperating fully, but let's be clear. You have no body, no weapon, no witnesses, and no evidence linking him to any crime. This is harassment based on circumstantial connections to a cold case you're desperate to close." Sarah opened the case file slowly, deliberately, letting the moment stretch. "We have your client's DNA on a cigarette but found in Riley Watson's abandoned vehicle. The cigarette was smoked by someone sitting in the driver's seat. Riley Watson's coworker positively identified your client as the older boyfriend Riley was dating in early 1999. We have photographs showing Riley in your client's car, including clear images of the distinctive watch he wore. The same watch he's wearing right now." Thomas's hand instinctively moved to his wrist, touching the silver watch before he could stop himself. Gerald placed a restraining hand on his client's arm. "Coincidental. The watch is not unique. Many people owned similar watches in the 90s. As for the DNA, perhaps Mr. Brennan gave Riley a ride at some point. That doesn't prove murder. It doesn't even prove a crime occurred. It proves he lied," Marcus interjected, his voice hard with 25 years of frustration. "In 1999, when we interviewed him during the initial investigation, he stated he didn't know Riley Watson. He said he'd never been to the Stardust Casino, never had any contact with her. That was a lie. Why lie if you have nothing to hide?" Thomas leaned forward, his eyes finding Marcus's. "I was young and stupid. My father was running for city council that year. The last thing he needed was his son connected to some missing cocktail waitress. So yes, I lied. I told investigators I didn't know her because I didn't want the scandal. But I didn't hurt her. I would never hurt anyone." "Tell us about your relationship with Riley," Sarah said, her tone shifting to something softer, more understanding. It was an old interrogation technique. Be the sympathetic ear, the person who understands how things can spiral out of control. "You were dating her, right? That's what her friends say. That she was seeing someone older, someone in real estate." Thomas looked at Gerald, who nodded slightly. "We dated briefly. A few weeks, maybe 2 months. It wasn't serious. She was young, I was going through things. My father was hard on me, demanding. Riley was fun, easy to be around. But it ran its course. We stopped seeing each other. That's all." "When did you stop seeing each other?" "I don't remember exactly. Late February, early March. It was mutual." "That's not what Jennifer Martinez says." Sarah pulled out a statement, reading aloud. "Jennifer Martinez, Riley's closest friend and coworker, states that Riley was planning to break up with you on March 15th, 1999. She says Riley was scared of how you'd react, that you'd been possessive and controlling, calling constantly, showing up at her work unannounced. She says Riley confided that you didn't like her working at the casino, didn't like her talking to other men. That's not true." But Thomas's voice had lost some of its certainty. "Jennifer never liked me. She thought I was too old for Riley, thought I was taking advantage of her. Whatever she says is colored by that bias." "Let's talk about March 15th, 1999, Marcus said. "Where were you that night between midnight and 4 a.m.? "I don't remember. It was 25 years ago." "Try." Thomas closed his eyes, his jaw working. "I was probably home, asleep, alone. My father and I had been fighting about the business. I was stressed, exhausted. I probably went to bed early." "You weren't waiting for Riley outside the Stardust at 2 a.m.? "No." "You weren't driving your silver BMW in the parking lot when Riley's shift ended?" "No." "You didn't smoke a cigarette in her car while sitting in the driver's seat?" "I don't smoke." "You did in 1999. Sarah slid a photograph across the table. Thomas at a party, a cigarette in his hand, smoke curling around his face. This was taken in January 1999, 2 months before Riley disappeared. "You're clearly smoking." "I quit." Thomas's voice was strained now, defensive. "I quit I don't remember when, But I did quit. Gerald Moss intervened smoothly. Detective, do you have any physical evidence, beyond a cigarette but that could have been deposited at any time, that links my client to Riley Watson's disappearance? Any witnesses who saw them together that night? Any surveillance footage, phone records, anything beyond speculation and the testimony of a friend who admittedly disliked their relationship? Sarah leaned back, studying Thomas's face. She'd seen guilty people before, watched them squirm and sweat and eventually crack under the weight of their own lies. But Thomas was different. He had the confidence of someone who'd spent 25 years convincing himself his own story was true, who'd buried the truth so deep under layers of respectability and success that he almost believed his own innocence. "We're searching your properties right now," she said calmly. "Your house, your office, your father's old property storage units. If there's any evidence connecting you to Riley's death, we'll find it." For the first time, genuine fear flickered across Thomas's face. "You can't do that without a warrant." "We have warrants." Sarah produced the documents signed by a judge that morning. "We have warrants for everything. Your vehicles, your financial records, your phone logs. We're going to reconstruct March 15th, 1999, minute by minute. And if you hurt that girl, if you took her life because she wanted to be free of you, we're going to prove it." While Sarah and Marcus questioned Thomas, the Las Vegas community was erupting in shock and disbelief. Social media lit up with hashtags, #RileyWatson, #Justice for Riley, #Brennan arrested. The local news channels interrupted regular programming with breaking news alerts, showing footage of Thomas being led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of injured innocence. At the Brennan family home in Summerlin, Thomas's wife Catherine collapsed into her sister's arms, sobbing. "It can't be true," she kept repeating, as if saying it enough times would make it reality. "Thomas wouldn't hurt anyone. He's a good man. He's a good father." Their 3 children, ages 22, 19, and 16, huddled together in the living room, their phones buzzing with texts from friends and reporters seeking comments. The oldest, Thomas Jr., turned off his phone and stared at the wall, unable to process that his father, the man who'd coached his little league team, who'd taught him to drive, who'd always preached honesty and integrity, might be a murderer. Across town, in a modest apartment in Henderson, Jennifer Martinez watched the news with tears streaming down her face. Her husband held her as she sobbed, finally releasing 25 years of guilt and grief. "I should have done more," she whispered. "I should have protected her better. I should have told the police everything, pushed harder, made them listen." "You did what you could," her husband said, but they both knew the words were empty comfort. Jennifer had lived with survivor's guilt for a quarter century, wondering what she might have said or done differently to save her friend's life. The press conference happened at 6 p.m., the district attorney standing before a wall of microphones and cameras. Victoria Ramirez had been Nevada's DA for 8 years, and she knew the weight this case carried, not just for Riley Watson's family, but for every cold case victim whose killer had walked free for decades. "Today, we arrested Thomas Brennan on charges of second-degree murder in connection with the 1999 disappearance and death of Riley Watson," Victoria announced, her voice steady despite the camera flashes. "This arrest is the result of persistent investigative work by our cold case unit, utilizing advanced DNA technology that wasn't available 25 years ago. We have strong evidence linking Mr. Brennan to Ms. Watson's disappearance, and we are confident in our ability to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt." Questions erupted from the press corps. "Do you have a body? Where was Riley Watson killed? How did she die? Is Thomas Brennan talking? What evidence do you have?" Victoria raised her hand for silence. "We cannot discuss specific evidence while the case is under investigation. What I can tell you is that Riley Watson was an 18-year-old girl with her whole life ahead of her. She had dreams, aspirations, people who loved her. She was taken from us 25 years ago, and justice has been delayed far too long. Today is the first step in finally giving Riley the justice she deserves." That night, candlelight vigils spontaneously organized throughout Las Vegas. People gathered at the corner where the Stardust once stood, before it was imploded in 2007 to make way for new development. They brought flowers and photos, creating makeshift memorials to a girl most of them had never known, but whose story had haunted the city for a generation. An elderly woman named Marie Chen, no relation to Detective Sarah, stood at the vigil with tears in her eyes, remembering the posters she'd seen so many years ago. "I have daughters," she told a reporter. "Granddaughters now. Every time I heard about Riley Watson, I thought about them. I thought about how easily it could be one of them. This arrest, it doesn't bring her back, but it tells us that we haven't forgotten. We're still fighting for her." James Watson arrived in Las Vegas on a red-eye flight, his eyes hollow from lack of sleep and the reopening of old wounds. Sarah and Marcus met him at the airport, leading him to a quiet room at the police station where they could talk without the media frenzy that surrounded the case. "Is it really him?" James asked, his voice rough with exhaustion and barely contained rage. "Are you sure?" "We're sure," Sarah confirmed. "The DNA is conclusive. The circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. Your sister was dating Thomas Brennan in early 1999. She was planning to break up with him the night she disappeared. He was the last person to see her alive." James's hands clenched into fists on the table. "Where is she? Where's my sister's body?" "We don't know yet." Marcus's voice was gentle, understanding the agony of unanswered questions. "We're searching Brennan's properties, following every lead. The desert around Las Vegas is vast, and 25 years is a long time. But we won't stop looking. I promise you that." "My mother died not knowing," James whispered. "She spent 10 years hoping Riley would walk through the door. The last thing she said to me before the cancer took her was Riley's name. She wanted to know if we'd found her. I had to tell her no. I had to watch her die with that hope unfulfilled." Sarah reached across the table, placing her hand over James's. "Your mother knew you never stopped searching. That matters. And Riley knows, wherever she is, that someone is finally fighting for her." The search of Thomas Brennan's properties began at dawn the next day. Forensic teams descended on his house, his office, the storage units that had once belonged to his father's property management company. They brought ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and decades of experience finding secrets people thought they'd buried too deep to uncover. In a storage unit off Boulder Highway, in a box marked Business Records 1998 to 2000, investigators found a leather-bound planner from 1999. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but Thomas Brennan's handwriting was still legible. On March 15th, circled multiple times in red pen, were the words, "End it, 2 a.m. Detective Chen held the planner with gloved hands, her heart racing. End it could mean ending the relationship, but the timing 2 a.m., the exact time Riley's shift ended, suggested something more sinister. The pages before that date were filled with notes about Riley. Where she worked, her schedule, the names of her friends. It read like surveillance, obsession documented in careful script. "He was tracking her," Marcus said, photographing each page. "Look at this, he knew her every move. What time she woke up, what bus she took to work, which coworkers she talked to during breaks. This is stalking behavior." Further back in the storage unit, buried under boxes of old tax documents and property leases, they found a black duffel bag. Inside, a woman's silver necklace with a turquoise pendant, a Stardust Casino employee badge with Riley Watson's smiling face, and a single high-heeled shoe, silver, size 7, the kind cocktail waitresses wore during their shifts. Sarah's hands trembled as she bagged each item. These were Riley's possessions, kept like trophies or twisted mementos. The necklace Thomas had given her, which she'd worn every day according to Jennifer's testimony. The employee badge she would have needed to clock in and out of work. The shoe that had no match, no explanation for why it was here except that something terrible had happened to its owner. "We've got him," Sarah breathed. "This is physical evidence. He had her belongings. He kept them for 25 years. The discovery made national news within hours. Cable networks interrupted programming to report the break in the case. Legal analysts debated the significance of the evidence. Defense attorneys argued it was circumstantial. Prosecutors insisted it demonstrated guilt and consciousness of guilt. Everyone had an opinion about Thomas Brennan and Riley Watson, about justice delayed and truth revealed. In his jail cell, Thomas sat with his head in his hands, the reality of his situation finally penetrating the armor of denial he'd worn for a quarter-century. Gerald Moss sat across from him, legal pads spread across the metal table, trying to construct a defense from fragments of lies and half-truths. "They found her things in your storage unit," Gerald said flatly. "The necklace, the badge, the shoe. How do you explain that?" Thomas looked up, his face haggard. "I kept them. After she left, after she disappeared, I kept them to remember her. It doesn't mean I killed her. Why would you keep mementos of a woman you claimed you barely knew? A woman you denied having any relationship with when investigators first questioned you?" I panicked. I was 26 years old. My father was running for office. I was scared of being implicated in something I didn't do. Thomas's voice cracked. "Yes, we dated. Yes, I cared about her. But I didn't kill her. I swear on my children's lives. I didn't kill her." "Then what happened that night?" "The truth, Thomas. I can't help you if you keep lying." Thomas was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "She wanted to end things. She called me that afternoon, said we needed to talk after her shift. I knew what that meant. Couldn't lose her. She made me feel like I mattered, like I was more than just my father's disappointing son." "So you went to the Stardust?" Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. I waited in the parking lot. She got in my car. We drove around, talking. She was kind about it, gentle. That made it worse somehow. She said she cared about me but needed space, needed to figure out her own life. I got angry. I said things I shouldn't have said. We argued. And then she got out of the car. We were near Flamingo Road, in some parking lot. She said she'd walk home, that she needed to clear her head. I watched her walk away. That's the last time I saw her. Gerald leaned back, his expression skeptical. "That's your story? She just walked away and disappeared? And you kept her necklace, her badge, her shoe as what? Souvenirs of your breakup?" I went back later that night, maybe an hour later. I felt guilty for how I'd acted. Her car was still in the lot, empty. The keys were in the ignition, her purse on the seat. But she was gone. Panicked. I took some of her things, thinking maybe they'd help me find her. But then days passed, then weeks, and I realized how bad it looked. So I hid everything and pretended I'd never known her. You expect anyone to believe that? It's the truth. But truth, Gerald knew, was a flexible concept in a courtroom. What mattered was what could be proven, what a jury would believe. And right now, the evidence painted a picture of a possessive man who'd killed the woman trying to leave him, then spent 25 years building a life on top of her grave. The investigation expanded like ripples in water, touching more lives each day. Detectives interviewed everyone who'd known Thomas in 1999, co-workers, family members, friends. They built a timeline of his movements, his behavior, the gradual shift from charming boyfriend to controlling presence. Sarah tracked down Raymond Torres's widow, Maria, who lived in a retirement community in North Las Vegas. The elderly woman welcomed Sarah into her small apartment, surrounded by photographs of the husband she'd lost to cancer 9 years earlier. "Raymond never forgot that girl," Maria said, serving coffee in delicate china cups. "He'd talk about her sometimes, especially around the anniversary of when she disappeared. He felt guilty that he couldn't do more to help find her." "Your husband's testimony was crucial," Sarah said gently. "He saw Riley get into that silver BMW. He identified the driver as someone who'd been hanging around the casino, someone Riley seemed to know. That's important evidence." Maria nodded slowly. "There's something else. Raymond didn't tell the police at the time because he wasn't sure, and he didn't want to get anyone in trouble without being certain. But a few weeks before Riley disappeared, he saw her arguing with a man in the parking lot, a man who matches the description of this Thomas Brennan they arrested. Sarah sat forward, her attention sharpening. What were they arguing about? Raymond couldn't hear everything, but he heard Riley say she couldn't keep doing this, that she needed him to understand she had her own life. The man grabbed her arm, not violently but firmly, possessively. Raymond started walking toward them, and the man let go and drove away. Riley was crying. Raymond asked if she was okay, and she said it was just relationship drama, that she could handle it. Why didn't your husband report this? He did, eventually. After Riley disappeared, he told the investigators. But I don't think they took it seriously. Young couples argue. It didn't seem significant at the time. But Raymond always wondered. He'd say, what if I'd done more? What if I'd told her to stay away from that man? He carried that weight until he died. Sarah documented everything Maria remembered, each detail another brick in the wall of evidence surrounding Thomas Brennan. The picture emerging was of a man who couldn't accept rejection, who saw Riley not as a person with her own agency but as something he owned, something he controlled. Back at the station, Sarah and Marcus constructed a massive timeline on the conference room wall. Every interaction between Thomas and Riley, every witness statement, every piece of evidence. It stretched across 12 feet of whiteboard, a visual representation of how carefully Thomas had hidden his crime. He almost got away with it, Marcus said, staring at the timeline. If not for the DNA technology, if not for you reopening this case, he would have become mayor. He would have spent the rest of his life free while Riley stayed buried in the desert. But he didn't get away with it, Sarah replied firmly. Justice might be slow, but it's not blind. Not anymore. The preliminary hearing was set for early April, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. The prosecution was building a narrative of obsession, control, and violence. The defense was constructing an alternative theory, that Riley had walked away from Thomas's car and been abducted by someone else, a random predator who'd seen an opportunity. In Portland, James Watson prepared to return to Las Vegas for the hearing. He'd taken a leave of absence from his contracting business, unable to focus on anything except the case that had reopened wounds he'd thought had scarred over. His wife held him at night when the nightmares came. Dreams of Riley calling for help, dreams of the desert keeping its secrets. I should have protected her better, James told his wife one night, his voice breaking. I was her big brother. That was my job. And I let her go to Vegas. Let her walk into danger because I was too wrapped up in my own life to see what was happening. You were 23 years old, his wife reminded him gently. Riley made her own choices. You couldn't have known what would happen. No one could have known except the man who killed her. But guilt doesn't listen to reason. James had spent 25 years wondering what he could have done differently, and now that they'd found Riley's killer, the guilt had transformed into rage. Cold, focused, demanding satisfaction. In Las Vegas, the community remained divided. Thomas Brennan's supporters insisted he was innocent, a good man caught in a political witch hunt. They organized rallies outside the courthouse, carrying signs that read "innocent until proven guilty" and "justice for Brennan." His campaign staff maintained his innocence, releasing statements about his character and public service. But Riley's supporters were louder, more passionate. They'd waited 25 years for someone to care about a missing cocktail waitress, and they weren't going to let Thomas Brennan's wealth and connections silence her again. Vigils continued nightly. A memorial fund was established in Riley's name to help other families of missing persons. The Stardust's former location became an unofficial shrine, covered in flowers and photographs and handwritten notes to a girl who'd never come home. Jennifer Martinez became an unofficial spokesperson for Riley, giving interviews about her friend's dreams and fears, about the warning signs she'd seen but couldn't stop. Riley was planning to go to community college, Jennifer told a reporter from the Las Vegas Review-Journal. She wanted to study hospitality management, maybe own her own restaurant someday. She had ambition, intelligence, kindness. She was so much more than just a missing person case number. She was real, and she mattered, and someone took all of that away from her. The forensic searches continued throughout late March. Cadaver dogs swept through desert areas near the property management sites Thomas had worked in 1999. Ground-penetrating radar scanned vacant lots that had once belonged to his father's company. Divers searched retention ponds and reservoirs. The search was methodical, exhaustive, driven by the determination to find Riley and bring her home. On March 28, 13 days after Thomas's arrest, a search team working near a long-abandoned construction site off Highway 15 made a discovery. The cadaver dog, a German shepherd named Justice, alerted to a disturbed area beneath a concrete foundation that had never been completed. When excavation began, carefully removing layers of desert soil and construction debris, they found bones. Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the excavation site, watching forensic anthropologists work with brushes and tools, slowly revealing what had been hidden for 25 years. The bones were human, female, consistent with a young adult. Near the skeletal remains were fragments of fabric, sequins that might have once been part of a cocktail waitress uniform. A few inches away, the matching silver high-heeled shoe to the one found in Thomas's storage unit. "We found her," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Riley, we found you." The identification would take time, dental records, DNA comparison, forensic analysis. But Sarah knew in her bones that they'd finally located Riley Watson. The construction site had belonged to Thomas Brennan Properties in 1999. Thomas had been supervising the project when work was suddenly halted due to permit issues. The concrete foundation had been poured in mid-March 1999, right after Riley disappeared. Marcus arrived at the site an hour later, having raced from the station when he got Sarah's call. He stood beside his partner, looking down at the excavation, and for the first time in 25 years, allowed himself to believe they'd really done it. They'd solved the unsolvable case. They'd brought Riley Watson home. His father's construction site, Marcus said quietly. He had access, opportunity, and a fresh concrete pour scheduled. He knew exactly how to hide a body where no one would find it. Thomas Brennan died in 2018, Sarah noted. Do you think he knew? Do you think he helped his son cover up a murder? We may never know. But if he did, he took that secret to his grave. The discovery of Riley's remains changed everything. What had been a missing person case was now definitively a murder investigation. The charges against Thomas Brennan were upgraded to first-degree murder, premeditated intentional killing. The prosecution now had a body, a cause of death, forensic analysis would reveal blunt force trauma to the skull, and a clear timeline connecting Thomas to Riley's death and burial. The forensic anthropology report arrived on April 3rd, definitively confirming what everyone already knew in their hearts. The remains found at the construction site belonged to Riley Watson. Dental records matched, mitochondrial DNA extracted from bone marrow matched samples from James Watson, and the cause of death was determined to be multiple blunt force trauma impacts to the skull, consistent with being struck with a heavy object. Dr. Patricia Gomez, the forensic anthropologist who'd examined the remains, delivered her findings to Sarah and Marcus in a conference room that smelled of stale coffee and determination. Based on fracture patterns and bone analysis, Riley Watson was struck at least 4 times on the back and side of her head with significant force. The weapon was likely something with a flat surface, possibly a shovel or similar tool. Death would have been rapid within minutes. The blows indicate rage, loss of control. Sarah's stomach churned at the clinical description of Riley's final moments. A young woman who just wanted to be free, struck down by someone who claimed to care about her. Could it have been accidental? Could he have hit her once and then panicked? Dr. Gomez shook her head firmly. For separate impact sites, all delivered with enough force to fracture the skull. This wasn't an accident or a single moment of lost temper. This was sustained violence. Someone kept hitting her even after the first blow would have incapacitated her. The report also revealed something else. Evidence of defensive wounds on Riley's forearm bones, suggesting she'd raised her arms to protect herself. She'd known what was happening. She'd tried to defend herself. In her final moments, Riley Watson had fought for her life. James Watson sat in the same conference room an hour later, listening to the findings with a face carved from stone. Sarah watched him process each detail, saw the moment when clinical facts transformed into images he'd never be able to unsee. His baby sister, terrified and alone, dying in the desert while their mother waited at home for a phone call that would never come. "I want to see her," James said finally, his voice hollow. "I want to see my sister." "James, the remains have been in the ground for 25 years, Marcus said gently. "They're not. She's not. I don't care. She's been alone out there for a quarter century. I need to be with her. I need to tell her I'm sorry I didn't protect her." Sarah reached across the table, gripping James's hand. "You can be present during the reburial after the forensic examination is complete. We'll make sure Riley has a proper funeral, that she's laid to rest with dignity. Your sister won't be alone anymore." The upgraded murder charges brought Thomas Brennan back to court for another arraignment. This time, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, Riley's supporters, Thomas's family trying to maintain their belief in his innocence. Judge Helena Morrison presided, her stern face betraying no emotion as Thomas was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him. The transformation from confident politician to accused murderer was stark. Thomas had lost weight in the 2 weeks since his arrest, his expensive suits replaced by prison attire, his carefully maintained image shattered. He wouldn't meet anyone's eyes as he stood before the judge. "Mr. Brennan, you are now charged with first-degree murder in the death of Riley Watson," Judge Morrison announced. "How do you plead?" Gerald Moss stood beside his client. "Not guilty, Your Honor. Bail is revoked given the severity of the charges and the fact that the defendant has significant financial resources. Trial is set for June 15th. Does the prosecution anticipate being ready?" Victoria Ramirez stood, her bearing confident. "Yes, Your Honor. The people are ready to proceed." As Thomas was led away, James Watson stood in the gallery, his eyes locked on the man who'd killed his sister. Their gazes met for a brief moment, killer and brother, separated by metal detectors and bailiffs, but connected forever by Riley's death. Thomas looked away first, unable to hold the weight of James's grief and rage. Outside the courthouse, the media scrum was chaotic. Reporters shouted questions at everyone involved in the case. Thomas's wife Catherine made a brief statement, her voice shaking but her words carefully chosen. "Our family is devastated by these accusations. Thomas maintains his innocence, and we stand by him. But our hearts also break for Riley Watson and her family. Whatever the truth is, a young woman lost her life, and that is a tragedy everyone must acknowledge." Jennifer Martinez stood with James Watson at a separate press conference, organized by Riley's supporters. Jennifer's children stood behind her, old enough now to understand their mother's pain. "Riley was my best friend," Jennifer said, tears streaming freely. "For 25 years, I've carried the guilt of not protecting her better. But today I want to focus on who she was, not just how she died. Riley was kind, funny, ambitious. She had dreams. She wanted to make something of her life. Thomas Brennan took all of that away from her, and now he needs to face justice for what he did." James added, his voice rough with emotion. "My sister deserves to be remembered as more than a victim. She was a fighter. The evidence shows she fought for her life. That's who Riley was, someone who never gave up. And we won't give up either until justice is served." The investigation expanded to examine Wallace Brennan's potential involvement in covering up his son's crime. Detectives reviewed construction records from March 1999, finding that the concrete pour at the abandoned site had been scheduled for March 16th, the day after Riley disappeared, but was moved up unexpectedly to March 15th, the same night Riley was killed. The shift supervisor who'd overseen that concrete pour, a man named Robert Chen, again, no relation to Detective Sarah Chen, was now 73 years old and living in Arizona. When Sarah and Marcus flew to Phoenix to interview him, they found a man eager to finally tell the truth. "I always knew something was wrong with that pour," Robert said, sitting in his backyard under the desert sun. "Wallace Brennan called me personally. He never called me personally, telling me we needed to pour that foundation that night instead of waiting until morning. Said there were weather concerns, that we needed to get it done before a storm rolled in. But there was no storm predicted. The night was clear." "Did you see Thomas Brennan at the site that night?" Marcus asked. "I did. He showed up around midnight, which was strange because he usually worked days. He seemed agitated, kept checking his watch, asking when we'd be done. Wallace arrived maybe an hour later, and they talked privately for a while. Then Wallace told me to have my crew focus on the south section of the foundation first, that it was the priority area. The south section. Is that where Riley's remains were found? Robert nodded slowly. I didn't put it together at the time. I was just following orders. But yeah, that's the section. Thomas insisted on being present when we poured the concrete there. He even helped guide the pour, which supervisors never did. He was hands-on, making sure it was thick, even, completely covered. The implications were devastating. Thomas Brennan had helped his son bury a murder victim, had used his company's resources and his authority to conceal a crime. The concrete foundation had been perfect cover, a legitimate construction project that no one would think to investigate. By the time police were searching for Riley weeks later, the concrete had cured, and there was no visible evidence that anything was buried beneath. Did Wallace ever say anything about it afterward? Sarah asked. Any indication he knew what they'd done? Robert was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. Once, maybe 5 years later, we were doing inventory of old sites. Wallace pulled out the plans for that abandoned construction project. The permits had never been sorted, so the site just sat there, unfinished. He looked at those plans for a long time. Then he said something I've never forgotten. Some foundations hold more than buildings. Some foundations hold secrets that should stay buried. I didn't understand what he meant then. But now, armed with Robert's testimony, investigators obtained warrants to search Thomas Brennan's estate records, personal papers, anything that might provide more evidence of a cover-up. In a safety deposit box at a bank in Henderson, they found a letter sealed, addressed to whom it may concern, meant to be opened only after Wallace's death. The letter was dated April 2018, written shortly before Wallace died of a heart attack. In shaky handwriting, he'd confessed to helping Thomas dispose of Riley Watson's body. He'd written, "I helped my son because he was my son, and a father's love sometimes makes monsters of us all." Thomas called me at 11 p.m. on March 15, 1999, hysterical. He said there'd been an accident, that Riley had fallen and hit her head, that she was dead. He begged for my help. I should have called the police. Instead, I called my construction crew and moved up a concrete pour to bury a girl's body like she was construction debris. I told myself I was protecting my family, preserving our name, ensuring Thomas's future. But the truth is I was an accomplice to murder. I enabled my son to escape justice for taking a young woman's life. I have lived with this guilt every day since. It has poisoned every success, tainted every happy moment. The foundation I poured that night became the foundation of our family's lie. If you are reading this, I am dead and beyond earthly punishment. But my son Thomas is not. He must face what he did. Riley Watson deserves justice. Her family deserves truth. I am sorry I was too much of a coward to give it to them while I lived. The letter was like a bomb detonating in the middle of the case. Thomas Brennan had confessed from beyond the grave, providing evidence that his son had called him immediately after Riley's death, that the accident claim was a lie Thomas had told even his own father. The letter also confirmed that Riley was already dead when the cover-up began, meaning Thomas had killed her and then sought help hiding the body. Gerald Moss received a copy of the letter and met with Thomas in jail the following day. The defense attorney's face was grim as he slid the document across the table. Your father's confession. It destroys any remaining doubt about your involvement in Riley's death. Thomas read the letter slowly, tears streaming down his face. My father. He promised he'd never tell. He promised the secret would die with us. It has died with him, but it's talking from the grave now. Gerald leaned back, exhausted. Thomas, I need the complete truth. Not the version you've been telling yourself for 25 years. The actual truth. Because this letter proves you were involved in disposing Riley's body. The only question left is whether you killed her or if it really was an accident like you claimed. Thomas was silent for a long time, his hands trembling on the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet Gerald had to lean in to hear. It wasn't an accident. I lost control. She was walking away from me, saying she never wanted to see me again. I grabbed her arm, tried to make her listen. She pulled away, started running. I chased her. And when I caught up, she turned and said she was going to tell everyone what a controlling psycho I was, that she'd make sure no one would date me again. And then, there was a shovel in my trunk. Construction equipment I'd borrowed from one of the sites. I grabbed it. I just wanted to scare her, make her understand how serious this was. But she laughed at me. She actually laughed and said I was pathetic. Something inside me snapped. I swung the shovel. She went down. And then I swung again, and again, until she stopped moving. Gerald closed his eyes, processing the confession he'd known was coming but hoped to avoid. You killed her because she rejected you, because she laughed at you. I killed her because I couldn't let her leave, Thomas whispered. She was mine. She made me feel important. And when she tried to take that away, I couldn't allow it. The confession sealed Thomas Brennan's fate. Gerald Moss knew that no jury would acquit a man who'd brutally murdered a young woman for daring to end a relationship. The only question now was whether to fight the charges and risk a trial, or negotiate a plea deal that would avoid the death penalty. The community reaction to Wallace Brennan's posthumous confession was explosive. The Brennan family name, once associated with business success and civic involvement, was now synonymous with murder and cover-up. Wallace's widow, Margaret Brennan, released a statement through her lawyer expressing shock and horror at her late husband's actions. I knew nothing of my husband's involvement in Riley Watson's death. Had I known, I would have gone to the police immediately. My heart breaks for Riley and her family. What my husband and son did is unforgivable. Thomas's wife Catherine filed for divorce the day after the confession came to light. In a brief statement, she said, I cannot and will not stand by a man who took an innocent life and then built our entire marriage on that lie. My children and I are victims of Thomas's deception as well. We extend our deepest condolences to Riley Watson's family and will cooperate fully with any investigation. The three Brennan children struggled to reconcile the father they'd known with the monster the evidence revealed. Thomas Jr. dropped out of UNLV where he'd been studying business, unable to face his classmates. The middle child, Emily, changed her name legally, wanting no connection to the Brennan legacy. The youngest, 16-year-old Michael, moved with his mother to California to start over far from Las Vegas. Riley's memorial service was held on April 15th, exactly 1 month after Thomas's arrest and 25 years and 1 month after her death. Hundreds attended, filling the chapel and spilling out into the parking lot. Jennifer Martinez delivered a eulogy that left no dry eye in the house. Riley Watson was my friend, my sister in all the ways that mattered. She was funny, smart, brave. She came to Las Vegas with $200 and a dream, determined to make something of herself. She should have had decades to fulfill that dream. Instead, she had 6 months before someone decided her life was worth less than his pride. Riley, wherever you are, I hope you know that you weren't forgotten. You were loved. You are loved. And we will make sure that your story reminds everyone that women's lives matter, that rejection is not justification for violence, that no man has the right to take a woman's life because she wants to be free. James Watson scattered some of Riley's ashes in the desert near Red Rock Canyon, a place she'd told him she loved during one of their last phone conversations. The rest would be buried beside their mother in Oregon, reuniting them in death as they'd been separated in life. I'm bringing you home, Riley, James whispered to the wind that carried the ashes across the red rocks. I'm so sorry it took so long, but you're free now. You're finally free. The trial began on June 15, 2024, in a courtroom that had been modified to accommodate the unprecedented public interest. Judge Helena Morrison maintained strict order, forbidding cameras inside but allowing a sketch artist to document the proceedings for the media pool outside. Thomas Brennan sat at the defense table looking diminished, as if the weight of his confession and his father's posthumous betrayal had physically compressed him. Gerald Moss had negotiated hard for a plea deal, but Victoria Ramirez was unwavering. This case was going to trial, and the jury would hear every detail of what Thomas had done. The prosecution's opening statement painted a devastating picture. Riley Watson was 18 years old when she met Thomas Brennan. She was naive, trusting, eager to believe that an older, established man saw something special in her. What she couldn't see, what none of us can see when we're young and in love, was that Thomas didn't see her as a person. He saw her as a possession. And when she tried to reclaim her own life, her own agency, her own future, he killed her. Victoria walked the jury through the evidence methodically. The DNA on the cigarette, the possessions kept like trophies, the eyewitness testimony from Raymond Torres, the planner with "End It. 2 a.m. circled in red. The construction records showing the suspicious concrete pour, and Wallace Brennan's confession letter. Each piece of evidence was a nail in the coffin Thomas had built for himself. Jennifer Martinez testified for 2 days, describing Riley's excitement about the relationship turning to fear, the phone calls that came too frequently, the possessiveness that escalated week by week. She told me she was going to break up with him after her shift on March 15th. She was nervous but determined. She said she couldn't live her life under someone else's control. Those were almost her exact words. "I can't live my life under someone else's control." 3 hours later, she was dead. Robert Chun, the construction supervisor, testified about the rushed concrete pour and Thomas's unusual insistence on being present. "I've worked construction for 50 years. I've never seen a property supervisor that hands-on about a foundation pour. He was there to make sure something stayed buried." The forensic evidence was presented in excruciating detail: the fracture patterns on Riley's skull, the defensive wounds on her arms, the sequins from her uniform mixed with the soil around her bones. Dr. Patricia Gomez explained to the jury exactly how Riley had died. She was struck 4 times with a flat, heavy object, likely a shovel. The first blow would have knocked her down. The second would have caused severe trauma. The third and fourth were delivered after she was already incapacitated, possibly unconscious. This was not a crime of passion that ended when the victim fell. This was sustained, deliberate violence. The defense tried to present Thomas as a young man who'd made a terrible mistake in a moment of rage, someone who'd been manipulated by an overbearing father into covering up what he claimed was originally an unintentional killing. Gerald Moss argued, "Thomas Brennan is guilty of a horrific crime. We're not disputing that. But this was not premeditated murder. This was a tragic confrontation that spiraled out of control, followed by a cover-up orchestrated by Wallace Brennan to protect his son." But the prosecution dismantled that narrative piece by piece. The planner entry ended. 2 a.m. suggested premeditation. The fact that Thomas had construction equipment in his car, the shovel that became the murder weapon, suggested preparation. The 4 separate blows to Riley's head suggested intent to kill, not a momentary loss of control. Thomas himself did not testify, exercising his Fifth Amendment right. His silence spoke volumes to the jury. If he was truly remorseful, if this was truly just a terrible accident, why wouldn't he tell his story directly? The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Thomas showed no emotion as the verdict was read, but his mother Margaret collapsed in the gallery, sobbing. His ex-wife Catherine had not attended the trial, protecting their children from the spectacle of their father's public destruction. Sentencing was set for August 1st. Nevada was a death penalty state, but Victoria Ramirez had decided not to pursue capital punishment. "Riley Watson's family has made clear they want justice, not revenge," she explained at a press conference. "Life in prison without possibility of parole ensures Thomas Brennan will never hurt anyone else, while sparing everyone the decades of appeals that accompany death penalty cases." James Watson agreed with the decision. "Killing Thomas won't bring Riley back. But knowing he'll spend every day for the rest of his life thinking about what he did, knowing he'll never be free while Riley is finally free, that's justice enough." On August 1st, Judge Morrison sentenced Thomas Brennan to life in prison without possibility of parole, plus additional years for tampering with evidence and abuse of a corpse. "Mr. Brennan, you took a vibrant young woman's life because she dared to assert her independence from you," the judge said, her voice ringing through the silent courtroom. "You then spent 25 years building a life, a family, a career on the foundation of her grave. You showed no remorse until you were caught. You maintained your innocence until the evidence became overwhelming. Even now, I sense your primary regret is being caught, not taking Riley Watson's life. You are a danger to society and will remain incarcerated until your death. Thomas was led from the courtroom in chains, disappearing into the Nevada Department of Corrections system where he would spend his remaining days. The media coverage was exhaustive. Cable news ran specials about the case. True crime podcasts dedicated multiple episodes to Riley's story, and a book deal was signed to tell the complete tale of the murder and investigation. But for those who'd loved Riley, the verdict and sentence were just the beginning of a different kind of journey. The legal process had ended, but healing would take much longer. Jennifer Martinez started a foundation called Riley's Voice, dedicated to helping young women recognize and escape from controlling relationships. She traveled to high schools and colleges, speaking about the warning signs she'd seen in Riley's relationship with Thomas, educating young people about the difference between love and control. Riley didn't know she was in danger until it was too late, Jennifer would tell audiences. The control started small. Too many phone calls, not liking her friends, subtle criticisms that eroded her confidence. By the time she recognized the danger, she was already trapped. We need to teach young people that love doesn't demand you give up your independence. Love doesn't require you to be smaller so someone else can feel bigger. Riley's Voice also provide. I'll complete the remaining approximately 2,000 words of Section 5 to bring the story to its conclusion. Support services for families of missing persons, connecting them with resources, legal aid, and counseling. Within 2 years, Riley's Voice had chapters in 12 states and had helped over 300 women safely exit dangerous relationships. James Watson found his own path to healing through advocacy. He worked with Nevada legislators to pass Riley's Law, which mandated advanced DNA testing on all cold cases involving missing persons and required law enforcement agencies to review unsolved cases every 5 years using the latest forensic technology. The law passed unanimously in 2025 and was quickly adopted as a model by other states. Riley can't speak for herself anymore, James said at the bill's signing ceremony, but her story can speak for countless others. Every cold case represents a family waiting for answers, a victim waiting for justice. Riley's Law ensures that no one is forgotten, that technology keeps working even when human memory fades. Sarah Chen received a commendation for her work on the case and was promoted to head of the cold case unit. But the professional recognition meant less to her than the letters she received from families of other missing persons, thanking her for showing that justice could still be found even decades later. She kept Riley's photograph on her desk, not the missing person poster, but a candid shot Jennifer had shared, showing Riley laughing with her whole face, alive and unaware that her time was running short. Marcus Webb retired 6 months after the trial, having finally closed the case that had haunted him for 25 years. At his retirement party, he told colleagues, "I became a detective because I believed in truth and justice." The Riley Watson case tested that belief every single day for a quarter century. I'm grateful I lived long enough to see it through. I'm grateful Sarah never gave up. And I'm grateful that Riley's voice was finally heard, even from beyond the grave. The Stardust Memorial site remained a place of pilgrimage for those touched by Riley's story. On the anniversary of her disappearance each year, hundreds gathered to remember not just Riley but all the missing and murdered young women whose cases remained unsolved. The shrine expanded to include photographs and names of other victims, turning Riley's tragedy into a catalyst for broader awareness. The Nevada Coalition Against Domestic Violence reported a 20% increase in calls to their hotline in the months following the trial. Women who'd been hesitant to leave controlling partners saw Riley's story and recognized themselves. They found the courage to seek help before it was too late. In that way, Riley saved lives even in death. Thomas Brennan adjusted slowly to prison life. He was housed in a protective custody unit, separated from the general population due to threats from other inmates who viewed crimes against women with particular contempt. He spent 23 hours a day in his cell, with 1 hour for exercise in a small concrete yard. The silver watch with the turquoise band had been taken from him as evidence, but he still found himself checking his wrist habitually, searching for something that was no longer there. His children never visited. His ex-wife Catherine remarried 2 years after the divorce, choosing a life far from Las Vegas and the shadow of the Brennan name. His mother Margaret visited once a month for the first year, then less frequently as her own health declined. She died in 2027, never having fully recovered from the revelation that both her husband and son were murderers. In his cell, Thomas had time to think. Decades of time, stretching out before him like the desert that surrounded the prison. He thought about Riley constantly, though whether from genuine remorse or self-pity was unclear even to himself. He'd robbed her of 50 years of life she should have lived. And in doing so, he'd robbed himself of the future he'd so carefully constructed on her grave. Sometimes, late at night when the prison was quiet except for the sounds of men sleeping or weeping or cursing their fates, Thomas would remember Riley's laugh, the way it had sounded in his car that night before everything went wrong. He'd remember how young she'd been, how full of dreams and possibilities. And he'd remember the moment when he'd decided those dreams were worth less than his wounded ego. That was the moment he'd become a murderer. Not when the shovel struck her skull, but when he'd decided his feelings mattered more than her life. The physical act was just the conclusion of a choice he'd already made, that she was his to control, his to keep, his to destroy if she tried to leave. The forensic psychologist who evaluated Thomas for the trial had diagnosed him with narcissistic personality disorder and an inability to accept rejection. But diagnoses felt like excuses, ways to explain away the fundamental truth. Thomas Brennan had killed Riley Watson because he'd believed himself entitled to her, and when she'd rejected that claim, he'd eliminated her rather than accept her autonomy. Jennifer Martinez visited Riley's grave every week for the first year. Then monthly as time passed and grief evolved into something less sharp but more permanent. She brought flowers, not roses, which Riley had thought were cliché, but wildflowers that looked like they belonged in the desert. She talked to Riley like she was still there, updating her on the Foundation's work, on the lives saved, on the justice finally achieved. "We did it," Jennifer whispered to the headstone on a clear October morning in 2025, exactly 1 year after Thomas's sentencing. "We made sure the world knows your name, knows your story, knows you mattered. You weren't just a missing person. You were Riley, brilliant, funny, brave Riley who deserved so much more than she got. But I promise you, your life meant something. You saved people, Riles. Even now, you're still saving people." The wind carried Jennifer's words across the cemetery, past rows of graves holding other stories, other lives cut short or lived to completion. Somewhere in that wind was Riley's spirit, or perhaps just the memory of her, which might be the same thing. Memory was how the dead lived on, how they continued to touch the living, how their voices echoed through years they'd never see. James Watson planted a garden in Portland in Riley's memory, filling it with the desert plants she'd loved, succulents and cacti and hardy flowers that bloomed in harsh conditions. His daughter, named Riley in honor of the aunt she'd never meet, played among the plants while James told her stories about the woman she was named for. "Your Aunt Riley was brave," he told 6-year-old Riley Watson too. "She went after her dreams even when they were scary. She stood up for herself even when it was dangerous. She fought until the very end. That's what I want you to remember about her. Not how she died, but how she lived." The younger Riley absorbed these stories the way children do, building an image of an aunt who felt mythical and real at once. She wore a silver necklace with a turquoise pendant, a replica of the one Thomas had given the first Riley, reclaimed now as a symbol of strength rather than possession. When people asked about it, young Riley would say, "It belonged to my Aunt Riley who never gave up." Sarah Chen worked through 53 more cold cases in the 3 years following Riley's case resolution. Advanced DNA technology helped close 21 of them, bringing answers to families who'd waited years or decades for truth. Each case mattered, but Riley's remained special, the one that had rekindled Sarah's faith that justice, though delayed, was still possible. On the 5-year anniversary of Riley's case being solved, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department unveiled a memorial wall honoring victims of unsolved homicides. Riley's name was prominently displayed, along with those of 37 others whose cases remained open. The wall served as both remembrance and accountability, a public commitment that these victims would not be forgotten, that the search for justice would continue. Las Vegas itself had changed in the years since Riley's death and the subsequent revelation of her murder. The Stardust was long gone, imploded and replaced by newer developments. The Strip had evolved, corporatized, sanitized. But beneath the gleaming facades and the carefully managed image of family-friendly entertainment, the city's darker truths remained. Riley's story became part of that truth, a reminder that violence against women wasn't just a problem in other places, that controlling relationships could turn deadly anywhere, that vigilance and awareness were necessary to protect the vulnerable. Schools taught about Riley's case in health classes. Police academies used it as an example of how cold cases could be solved with persistence and evolving technology. The Brennan name, once synonymous with business success and civic leadership, became a cautionary tale about the facades people built to hide their darkness. The properties Wallace Brennan had developed still stood throughout Las Vegas, but the company bearing his name was dissolved. The family's charitable foundation was restructured and renamed, its considerable resources redirected toward supporting victims of domestic violence. In the end, Riley Watson's legacy was one of transformation, personal, institutional, and cultural. She'd gone to Las Vegas chasing dreams, and though those dreams had been violently taken from her, her story had sparked changes that rippled outward, touching thousands of lives she'd never meet. On clear desert nights, when the neon lights of Las Vegas blazed against the darkness and tourists chased their own dreams through casino corridors, Riley's name lived on in the work of foundations, the text of laws, the memories of those who'd loved her, and the safety of women who'd escaped dangerous relationships because her story had taught them to recognize warning signs. She remained 18 forever in photographs and memory, frozen at the threshold of the life she should have lived. But the impact of her story, and the justice finally achieved, rippled forward through time, proof that even the dead could speak, that truth could emerge from decades of silence, and that no one was ever truly forgotten as long as someone kept fighting for them. Riley Watson had wanted to be free. 25 years after her death, 6 years after her killer's conviction, she finally was free from the desert grave that had held her, free from the silence that had surrounded her disappearance, free to be remembered not as a victim but as a person whose life and death had mattered, had meant something, had changed the world in ways both small and profound. The desert wind still blew across Las Vegas, carrying away secrets grain by grain. But Riley's secret had been revealed, her justice achieved, her voice finally heard. She was home. She was remembered. She was free. 10 years after Thomas Brennan's conviction, Detective Sarah Chen stood before a conference room filled with law enforcement officers from across the country. The National Cold Case Symposium had invited her to speak about the Riley Watson case and its broader implications for how police departments handled decades-old investigations. The technology matters, Sarah told the assembled detectives. DNA advances, digital databases, forensic improvements, these are crucial tools. But they're not enough. What solved Riley Watson's case wasn't just science. It was refusing to accept that some victims matter less than others. Riley was a cocktail waitress, a young woman far from home, someone society had trained us to see as disposable. That's why her case went cold. That's why Thomas Brennan thought he could get away with it. She clicked to the next slide, showing Riley's smiling face. We need to examine our own biases. Which cases do we prioritize? Which victims do we fight hardest for? Riley's case sat in a box for 25 years not because the evidence didn't exist, but because no one looked hard enough. We failed her not through incompetence, but through indifference. The room was silent, dozens of experienced investigators confronting uncomfortable truths about their profession. Sarah continued, since Riley's case closed, Las Vegas Metro has solved 18 additional cold cases using similar methodologies. But here's what's more important. We've changed how we approach missing person reports from the beginning. We don't dismiss young women who work in casinos or service industries. We don't assume they ran away or chose to disappear. We investigate every case like the victim matters, because they do. A detective from Seattle raised her hand. What about the families? How do you help them cope when answers come decades too late? Sarah's expression softened. You acknowledge that the wait was too long. You don't make excuses. James Watson, Riley's brother, told me something I'll never forget. He said, "Late justice is better than no justice, but it doesn't erase the years of not knowing. We can't give families back those years, but we can ensure the truth finally comes out. We can give them someone to hold accountable, and we can promise to do better for the next family." After her presentation, Sarah was approached by a young woman in her late 20s. "Detective Chen? I'm Riley Watson's niece, the one named after her. I wanted to thank you for what you did for my family." Sarah studied the young woman's face, seeing echoes of the girl in the photographs. The same green eyes, the same determined set to her jaw. "Your father speaks about you with such pride. You're studying criminal justice, right?" Riley Watson too nodded. "Because of you, and because of my aunt. I want to be the person who doesn't give up on victims, who keeps fighting even when cases seem impossible. My aunt deserved someone like that 25 years earlier. I want to be that person for someone else." They talked for an hour, Sarah sharing insights about the investigation, young Riley asking thoughtful questions about evidence preservation, witness interviews, and maintaining objectivity while caring deeply about justice. When they finally parted, Sarah felt the unique satisfaction of knowing Riley's legacy had inspired the next generation of investigators. Jennifer Martinez's foundation, Riley's Voice, had grown beyond anyone's expectations. By 2034, it operated in 23 states and had helped over 1,500 women safely exit dangerous relationships. The foundation's educational programs reached hundreds of thousands of high school and college students annually, teaching them to recognize controlling behavior, understand healthy relationship dynamics, and seek help when needed. Jennifer herself had become a nationally recognized advocate, testifying before Congress about the need for better domestic violence prevention programs and speaking at universities about the long-term impacts of intimate partner violence. She'd written a memoir, Speaking for Riley, which spent 12 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and sparked conversations about how society fails to protect vulnerable women. But the work that mattered most to Jennifer happened in small moments, talking to a frightened 20-year-old who recognized her boyfriend's controlling behavior because of Riley's story, helping a mother understand that her daughter's devoted boyfriend was actually isolating her from family and friends, providing resources to women who needed escape plans and safe houses. Riley wanted to matter, Jennifer said in interviews. She wanted her life to mean something. Through the foundation, she saved more lives in death than most of us will save in a full lifetime. That's her legacy. Not the tragedy of how she died, but the triumph of how her story keeps others alive. The Brennan family scattered after Thomas's conviction. His oldest son, Thomas Jr., eventually changed his name to Thompson and moved to Montana, where he worked as a wildlife photographer. He never married, never had children, unable to trust himself not to repeat his father's patterns despite having no history of violence. The fear that darkness was hereditary haunted him. Emily Brennan, now Emily Morrison, became a family law attorney specializing in protective orders and custody cases involving domestic violence. She used her father's crimes as motivation to protect others, though she never publicly discussed her connection to the case. Her colleagues knew her as fiercely dedicated and uncompromising when children's safety was at stake. The youngest, Michael, struggled the most. He cycled through therapists and rehabilitation programs, unable to process how the father who'd taught him to ride a bike and helped with homework was also a murderer. At 26, he finally found stability working at Riley's Voice headquarters, his insider understanding of how abusers operated making him effective at training counselors to recognize manipulation tactics. "My father taught me those tactics," Michael told new volunteers during training sessions. "Not intentionally. He thought he was teaching me about relationships and respect. But I watched him manipulate my mother for years before Riley's arrest. The excessive gifts followed by cold withdrawal. The way he made her feel crazy for questioning him. The isolation disguised as protection. I didn't recognize it as abuse then because he was so good at making it look like love." Catherine Brennan, Thomas's ex-wife, eventually remarried and found peace in a relationship built on equality and trust. She wrote an essay for a women's magazine about the experience of discovering her husband was a murderer, How the signs had been there, but she'd rationalized them away. How she'd confused control for devotion. "Thomas never hit me," she wrote. "He never threatened me physically, but he monitored my phone, questioned my friendships, made me account for every minute away from home. I told myself he was just protective, that his difficult childhood made him anxious. I didn't realize I was living with a man capable of murder until police arrested him for killing a girl who tried to do what I'd never had the courage to do. Leave." Her essay went viral, shared millions of times by women who recognized their own relationships in her words. It became required reading in Riley's voice education programs, a powerful testimony from someone who'd loved a murderer without knowing what he was capable of. Marcus Webb lived to see Riley's Law adopted by 42 states before his death in 2029 at age 81. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose cases he'd worked over his 4-decade career. Sarah Chen delivered the eulogy, speaking about Marcus's dedication to Riley Watson's case, even when everyone else had moved on. "Marcus never forgot Riley," Sarah said, her voice steady despite tears. "He carried her with him for 25 years. And when we finally brought her home, a part of him could rest too. He taught me that good police work isn't just about solving crimes. It's about refusing to accept that any victim is disposable, that any case is truly cold. As long as someone remembers, as long as someone keeps fighting, there's hope for justice." Thomas Brennan remained in prison, aging slowly in a cell that became both punishment and refuge. He was eligible for medical parole after developing heart disease in his 60s. But the parole board unanimously denied his request. Riley had been 18 when he killed her. He would serve every day of his life sentence, as she would have lived every day of the life he'd stolen. In rare interviews conducted by criminal psychology researchers, Thomas displayed what experts identified as shallow remorse. He was sorry for the consequences he'd faced, but showed limited genuine empathy for Riley or her family. He spoke about his own suffering, his lost political career, his estranged children, but rarely mentioned Riley except as a mistake that had cost him everything. He still doesn't see her as fully human. Dr. Yolanda Martinez, a forensic psychologist who evaluated Thomas in 2032, noted in her report, "He views Riley Watson as a catalyst for his downfall rather than as a person whose life had inherent value. This inability to recognize the humanity of others is characteristic of the personality disorder that contributed to his crime." The desert that had hidden Riley's body for 25 years became a different kind of memorial. Conservation groups established the Riley Watson Desert Preserve, 200 acres of protected land near Red Rock Canyon. Trails wound through the preserve, marked with educational signs about desert ecology and dedications to missing persons whose cases remained unsolved. Visitors walked those trails, some seeking peace, others seeking connection to Riley's story. A simple stone marker at the preserve's entrance read, "For Riley Watson and all whose voices were silenced. May we listen better. May we do better. May we never forget." James Watson visited the preserve on every anniversary of Riley's death, hiking the trails alone at dawn when the desert was cool and quiet. He was 65 now, his contractor business passed to his son-in-law, his days spent between family and advocacy work. The pain of losing Riley had never fully disappeared, but it had transformed into something he could carry, a weight that had become part of him rather than crushing him. "I talk to her still," James admitted to Sarah during one of their occasional lunches. "I tell her about her niece, about the foundation, about how her story changed things. I don't know if she hears me, but it matters that I keep speaking. Someone has to remember not just how Riley died, but who she was. Funny, ambitious, kind, imperfect, human. She deserves to be remembered as fully human." And she was. Riley Watson lived on in law books and foundation programs, in the preserved trails and memorial walls, in the young woman who carried her name and the thousands who carried her lessons. She lived in every life saved by someone recognizing warning signs, every case solved by investigators who refused to give up, every moment when society chose to value vulnerable lives rather than dismiss them. The desert wind still blew across Las Vegas, but it carried Riley's name now, not as a cautionary tale, but as a call to action, a reminder that justice delayed is still justice, that truth matters even when it comes too late, and that remembering the dead means fighting harder for the living. Riley Watson was free, and in that freedom, she had become something more than the 18-year-old girl who died in the desert. She had become a force for change, a voice for the voiceless, proof that even in death, a single life could matter immensely. The desert kept its secrets, but not forever. The truth emerged, grain by grain, carried on winds that never stopped blowing, never stopped revealing, never stopped reminding the world that every victim deserves to be remembered, every case deserves to be solved, and every life, no matter how brief, deserves to matter. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.